The laughter still echoes in my head. It wasn't just a chuckle, it was the kind of cruel, superior laughter that strips you of your dignity one note at a time. My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes, her perfect smile stretched wide, and said, "You're useless, trash." Her parents laughed first, then the rest followed like a pack of wolves scenting weakness. I stood there, gripping my glass, every word burning like acid. She thought she'd humiliated me. She thought I'd just stand there, old, broken, powerless. What she didn't know was that I'd already learned the most dangerous lesson life can teach: never underestimate the quiet ones. 30 minutes later, the party moved outside. The same crowd that had mocked me gathered around her, snapping photos while she posed beside a brand new Porsche 911 Turbo S. Their laughter turned to admiration. Their voices rose in envy. I walked toward them slowly, each step deliberate. Her father smirked, her mother whispered something smug. Then I stopped beside her, reached into my pocket and pressed the key fob. The car chirped. The headlights flashed. Every smile froze. I slid into the driver's seat, rolled down the window and said quietly, "Sorry, it's mine." The look on their faces was worth every dollar I'd ever earned. But that moment, that shock, was only the beginning. Because what came next wasn't just about a car. It was about truth, payback, and a revelation that would shatter everything they thought they knew about me. Keep watching. You won't believe how it ends. My name is Edward Miller. I'm 65 years old, a retired electrical engineer who spent most of his life designing energy systems for other people's dreams. I lost my wife Helen 5 years ago to cancer, and since then I've lived quietly in a small house outside Portland, fixing old cars and tending the garden she loved. I don't go to many social gatherings anymore, but that night my son Daniel insisted I attend a birthday dinner for his wife's parents, Harold and Miriam Bennett. He said it would mean a lot to Claire. I didn't know then how wrong he was. The Bennett's mansion looked more like a museum than a home. White marble floors, crystal chandeliers, walls filled with art whose names I couldn't pronounce. I arrived in my old gray suit, the one Helen had tailored years ago for our anniversary. It was neat, pressed, and modest qualities that in that house might as well have been sins. Daniel greeted me at the door with a nervous smile. "Dad, I'm glad you made it," he said, but his eyes darted toward the dining room like a man expecting trouble. Claire appeared beside him, her smile polished to perfection, every strand of hair in place. "Edward," she said, in that overly sweet tone that could slice glass, "you actually came." Inside, the long mahogany table glittered under soft lighting. Waiters in black vests poured wine that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Harold Bennett, a tall man with silver hair and the smug calm of someone who always gets the last word, stood at the head of the table. "Ah, the father-in-law," he said, extending his hand. His grip was limp, brief, and accompanied by the kind of smile people wear when they've already judged you. Miriam nodded, her eyes gliding over me as though evaluating a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. "So, Edward," she said, "Daniel tells us you used to be—" "What was it?" "An electrician, an electrical engineer," I corrected politely. "Oh, of course," Harold said with a chuckle. "I imagine that's a fine trade. Hard work builds character." I knew that tone. It wasn't respect, it was condescension dressed as charm. I'd heard it all my life from men who thought wealth was intelligence and titles were morality. I smiled anyway, because that's what polite people do when surrounded by predators. They stay still. Dinner was served on fine china, each course smaller than the last, each comment sharper. Claire told stories about Daniel's promotion, about their new opportunities, about learning to socialize with the right people. The right people. She said it like an invisible wall that divided the world into two kinds of souls, the useful and the discarded. When she glanced at me, it was as if she'd already decided which side I belonged to. "Dad still works on those old cars," Daniel said halfway through the meal, trying to make small talk. Claire laughed, tilting her head toward her mother. "Yes, he restores old junkers in that dusty little garage, doesn't he? It's adorable." Miriam covered her mouth, feigning a polite laugh. Harold just sipped his wine, amused. I felt my face warm, not from anger yet, but from the slow humiliation that spreads like heat under your collar. I could have defended myself. I could have reminded them that my patents still paid royalties, that I'd built systems for corporations whose lights they now dined under. But I didn't, because people like them don't hear truth, they only smell status. Dessert came a small slice of something French, beautifully arranged and tasteless. The conversation turned to family, and that's when the final strike came. Claire raised her glass and said, "To family, the ones who make us proud, and the ones who remind us what we never want to become." The table erupted in laughter. I didn't understand at first, but then she looked directly at me. Her eyes were cold and gleaming. "You're useless trash, Edward," she said with a smile so bright it could blind. The laughter grew louder. Even Daniel, sitting beside her, stared down at his plate, motionless. Time slowed. The sound of clinking glasses blurred into a hollow echo. I saw Helen in my mind, her gentle face, her quiet dignity. She'd warned me about this once. "People who measure worth by gold will never recognize grace," she'd said. And in that moment I realized how right she'd been. I reached for my wine glass, not to toast, not to drink, but to hold something steady in my trembling hand. The stem was cool, smooth grounding. I looked at Daniel, my son, my only family left, and he couldn't even lift his eyes. I could have shouted, could have exposed their hypocrisy right there, but there's a kind of power in silence. A storm doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. I stood slowly, setting the glass back on the table without a sound. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy hush. "Thank you for dinner," I said evenly, my voice steady as the hum of a current. "I'll be going now." Claire blinked, confused by the calm. "Already we haven't," I cut her off with a small smile. "You've done plenty, Claire." I turned to Daniel. "Take care of yourself, son." And then I walked out of that glittering room, past the chandeliers and the marble and the eyes that thought they'd broken me. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The stars above looked clearer than they had in years. I took a deep breath, and somewhere in that silence I heard Helen's voice again. "Don't let them break your spine." I looked back once at the house, its windows glowing with laughter that would soon fade into whispers. They thought they'd silenced me, but they were wrong. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile only a man with a plan wears, and murmured to the wind, "They'll remember this night differently one day." When I got home that night, the silence was heavier than usual. The drive from the Bennett's mansion had been quiet, but inside my chest, every heartbeat echoed with the sound of laughter that still clung to my memory. I hung my jacket by the door, the same jacket Helen used to brush the lint off before I went anywhere important. The house was dim, still holding her scent, the faint trace of lavender and machine oil that always seemed to follow her from the workshop. I turned on one small lamp in the living room, not for light, but for company. Her photo sat above the mantel, the one from our 30th anniversary where she wore that gold scarf, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. "You were right," I said to the picture. "They'd never understand. I should have gone to bed, but the weight in my chest wouldn't let me." There was something about that night, the humiliation, the finality of Claire's voice that made me need to feel Helen's presence again. I walked to the study, the one she'd turned into her design corner back when we both still dreamed about building something that would last. Against the far wall was a small wooden box, carved by hand, and worn smooth from years of her touch. She used to call it her future box. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I told myself I wasn't ready, but maybe I was just afraid. Afraid of how much of her would still be waiting for me inside. I sat down, the wood creaking under my weight, and placed the box on my lap. My fingers hesitated on the lid. The latch clicked softly like a breath releasing after years of holding. Inside were 12 envelopes, each sealed neatly, each labeled in Helen's delicate handwriting. My throat tightened. The sight of her writing hit harder than any insult I'd heard that evening. On the first envelope, "Open when you feel invisible." On the second, "Open when they call you worthless." The third, "Open when you're ready to fight back." A quiet laugh escaped me, half wonder, half disbelief. "You always knew me too well," I whispered. She must have written these in her final months when her body was failing, but her mind refused to stop building. That was Helen, always thinking ahead, always building something, whether it was engines or hope. I picked up the second envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed, edges curled with time. I ran my thumb along the seam before sliding a knife under the flap. The sound of tearing paper filled the silence like a small act of rebellion. Her handwriting was strong and steady, as if she'd written it yesterday. "Edward," it began, "if you're reading this, someone broke your heart. Don't let them break your spine. The Porsche isn't just a car, it's your armor. Drive it when you're ready to show them who you are." My hand trembled. I could almost hear her voice, calm and certain, every word laced with that unshakable kindness that had always grounded me. I read it again, slower this time, feeling the weight of each sentence. Don't let them break your spine. The words landed deep. Helen had seen something in me I'd forgotten, a man who didn't just survive but stood tall after every fall. I looked around the room at the blueprints still pinned to the walls, her notebooks stacked in tidy rows. We had worked side by side for decades, designing cleaner battery systems for electric vehicles back when no one cared about the future. The patents were in my name because Helen insisted it would make it easier with investors, but every line of every sketch carried her mind. And in that moment I realized she must have known that someday when people stopped seeing me, I'd need a reminder of who I'd been. The wind outside pressed gently against the windows, making the curtains sway like they were breathing. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into my shirt pocket and stood. My steps carried me to the garage without thinking. The air in there was colder, sharper. The smell of motor oil and metal grounded me like nothing else could. Under the soft light hung a dusty cover hiding the silhouette of the Porsche 911 Turbo S, the last project we worked on together. I pulled the sheet back and gold caught the light. It wasn't flashy gold, not the kind that screams for attention, but the deep, warm hue of something built with love and patience. Helen had chosen the color herself. Gold, she'd said once, because it's strong but quiet, like you. I opened the driver's door, the hinges sighing softly. The leather still carried her scent, lavender and a hint of the soldering iron she used. I sat in the seat, ran my hand over the steering wheel and felt her fingerprints in every stitch. On instinct, I reached toward the glove compartment. It had been locked since the day I parked the car. I took the small key hanging on my workbench and slid it into the lock. It clicked open with a sound that felt almost sacred. Inside lay a folded stack of papers tied with a blue ribbon. My heart thudded. On top, a small note in her handwriting, P.S. Check the glove box. I smiled through a sting of tears. Beneath the note was a set of blueprints, detailed schematics for an advanced lithium battery system. My breath caught. It was the design we'd been developing before she got sick, improved, refined, and annotated in her hand. But this wasn't just our old work, it was better, more efficient, cleaner, with calculations that even I hadn't thought of. She'd finished it without telling me. I spread the pages out across the passenger seat. The ink had faded in places, but the math was flawless. She'd drawn tiny hearts next to certain components the way she always did when she felt proud of her work. My fingers brushed over them and I felt something shift inside me, grief melting into purpose. The letter, the car, the plans, it was all a message. Helen hadn't just left me memories. She'd left me armor and ammunition. The humiliation from the dinner began to fade, replaced by something sharper, steadier. They saw me as useless because they didn't know what I carried. I closed the glove box gently, sat back and stared at the dashboard where Helen's initials were carved beside mine. I could almost hear her laugh, that quiet hum she made when she was satisfied with her work. For the first time in years, I felt her not as a loss but as a presence. The engine was silent, but in my mind it was already roaring to life. I traced the edge of the blueprint one more time and whispered, "All right, Helen. Let's remind them what gold looks like." The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air outside still carried that crisp, quiet cold that only early hours know. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the faint orange bleed across the horizon. Helen's letter from the night before sat on the table beside me, folded neatly, as if waiting to see what I would do next. "All right, Helen," I murmured again, the words heavier now that daylight had arrived. I finished my coffee, grabbed my jacket, and walked out to the garage. The hinges groaned when I opened the door, and the scent of oil, metal, and sawdust filled the air. Most people would have seen clutter boxes of old tools, parts stacked in quiet chaos, but to me it was a cathedral. Every corner of that space carried her fingerprints. The pegboard wall still had outlines of her wrenches drawn in black marker. On the far shelf sat an old radio she'd insisted on fixing herself. It still played only one station, some classical channel she'd loved to work to. I turned the dial out of habit and violins spilled softly into the cold air. The golden Porsche sat in the center, dust shimmering on its curves like frost on sunlight. I walked around it slowly, hand brushing the hood. Armor, she'd called it. Every night needs armor. I'd laughed then, but now the word felt different, truer. The car wasn't just a machine. It was our story made of metal. She'd built the design and I'd built the frame. Every screw carried a conversation, every weld a memory. I lifted the hood, the hinges sighing open. The engine gleamed like a sleeping beast waiting. I ran my hand along the cables, remembering how Helen used to hum while tightening bolts. The hum always matched her heartbeat, steady, precise, sure. I hadn't touched this car since the week she died. I couldn't. But now it felt wrong to leave it frozen in time. I rolled up my sleeves, wiped my hands on a rag, and got to work. Hours passed quietly. The radio played Vivaldi, and the rhythm of the tools filled the space between notes. Fixing something always calmed me, but this was different. It wasn't repair, it was resurrection. While cleaning the spark plugs, I noticed a small envelope wedged between the seats. My breath caught. Another one of hers. The label read, "Open when you're tired of being quiet." I sat back in the driver's seat, heart heavy. I tore it open carefully. Inside, her handwriting danced across the paper. "Silence can be noble, Edward, but sometimes it's just fear pretending to be wisdom. Speak when it matters. Even if your voice shakes." I let out a long breath, eyes stinging. She'd always known how I hid behind calmness, how I let politeness protect others more than myself. I folded the note, slid it into my pocket next to the first letter and whispered, "Not this time." I spent the afternoon polishing the frame, tightening bolts and rewiring the battery system. Helen's blueprint from the glove box lay open on the workbench. The math was complex but elegant, her mind captured on paper. I traced the lines with a fingertip, understanding not just the design but her intention. She'd wanted me to keep moving, to create, to build my dignity back piece by piece. Somewhere between the wires and grease, I began to feel alive again. By evening, the car looked different, still unfinished but awake. The gold paint caught the fading sunlight through the window, glowing like a promise. I sat beside it with another cup of coffee, the kind of tired that feels good. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt useful. I felt like Helen was sitting right there, handing me a wrench, teasing me for over-tightening a bolt. As the sky turned violet, I opened another envelope, one that had fallen behind the box of spare parts. It said, "Open when you doubt your worth." I smiled. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" I unfolded it carefully. "Your worth isn't in what they see, Edward. It's in what you build when they're not watching. Let your work speak louder than their noise." Those words settled deep. That's what she'd always believed, that dignity wasn't given, it was built. I decided then that I'd finish the Porsche not just for her, but for both of us. It would stand as proof that something beautiful can survive betrayal. It was almost dark when I heard the soft thud of mail dropping into the small metal box by the garage door. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over. The sound of the crickets outside filled the air as I opened the lid. Among the usual junk mail and catalogs was a thick white envelope stamped with the name of my bank. I frowned, tearing it open under the dim light. Inside were several printed documents, loan statements, signatures, property deeds. My name appeared in bold across the top, followed by Daniel's and Claire's. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but as I scanned the pages, my stomach dropped. The documents showed a home equity loan, hundreds of thousands of dollars secured against the deed to my house. My signature was there, but not mine. I leaned against the wall, the paper trembling in my hand. The signature was close, nearly perfect, but I'd recognize that forgery anywhere. The date on the document was recent, less than 2 months ago. Claire's fingerprints were all over this. Daniel's too. They'd mortgaged my home behind my back. A slow, cold calm settled over me. I looked back at the Porsche, its gold body gleaming softly in the half-light. Helen's words echoed, "Don't let them break your spine." I folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it on the workbench next to her blueprint. My voice was low but steady as I said to the empty air, "So this is what it's come to." The anger didn't boil, it crystallized, clear, controlled, and sharp. I turned off the lights, the garage sinking into shadows except for the faint glow from the Porsche's hood. I stood at the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked out into the dark yard. Somewhere a plan began to form, not out of vengeance, but out of something purer, quieter. Justice. I glanced once more at the mailbox. then at the envelope that had betrayed them both. My chest tightened, but my resolve was already set. Tomorrow I would start the next phase. But tonight I let the stillness wrap around me, the engine of my heart humming steady as the gold shimmered in silence. And that's when I whispered to Helen, "You were right again. Armor first, battle later." In the faint light from the window, the Porsche gleamed back at me like a silent oath, and I knew the fight had already begun. That night, I didn't sleep. The forged papers lay on my desk, their presence too loud to ignore. I kept turning them over under the lamp's warm light, studying every curve of the false signature that bore my name. Whoever had done it knew my hand well enough to fool a stranger, but not me. I traced the ink with my thumb, and a thought kept circling back like a whisper I didn't want to hear. Daniel, my own son. I wanted to believe he didn't know that Claire had gone behind his back the same way she'd gone behind mine, but the rational part of me knew better. Nothing in that house happened without her hand guiding it. By morning, I decided I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. Rage is easy. Proof takes patience. Helen used to say that when we disagreed on how to deal with people who underestimated us, patience is power in disguise, she'd tell me, smiling over her blueprints. So I chose patience. I bought a small voice recorder that looked like a keychain. The clerk at the hardware store assumed I needed it for dictation. "You a writer?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked outside the cafe where Daniel usually took his lunch. I'd memorized his schedule years ago without meaning to. Some habits of fatherhood never die, even when respect does. When he arrived, I watched him through the glass. He looked tired, collar loose tie, askew, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from hard work, but from trying to please the wrong people. A few minutes later, Claire's name flashed across his phone. I saw him hesitate before answering. His expression tightened as he listened. He turned away from the window, but I caught fragments of his voice when he stepped outside, pacing. "Claire, I told you it's risky," he said, voice low but sharp. A pause. "You said it was already handled." Another pause, longer this time. "You promised you'd talk to your father." Then, quieter, almost a plea. "You said this would help me get the regional position." My stomach turned. There it was. The truth, not just about the forgery, but about the hook she'd used to reel him in. I pressed the record button on the device in my pocket, letting it capture every word that drifted through the open cafe door. When Daniel hung up, he rubbed his face with both hands, the way Helen used to when she was disappointed. I waited until he went back inside before driving off. That evening, I sat in the garage with the Porsche, the recorder on the workbench beside me. I replayed the conversation, the static mixing with Daniel's voice. "You said this would help me get the regional position." I closed my eyes and let the words sink in. Claire had dangled ambition in front of him like bait, and he'd bitten without thinking about who might bleed for it. I opened another of Helen's envelopes, this one labeled "Open when you need clarity." Inside, her handwriting flowed across the page like music. "Truth is never as loud as lies, Edward. That's why it takes longer to be heard. Collect it carefully." I smiled faintly. Even from the grave, she was coaching me. I took out a small leather notebook I'd kept untouched for years and wrote at the top of the first blank page the Helen journal. Under it, I wrote my first entry: loan documents, forged signature, motive, career advancement, coercion, Claire's manipulation. Every night for a week, I added to that journal. I started recording every call I received from Daniel, every voicemail, every detail that might someday matter. He called 3 times during that week, always starting with the same brittle kindness. "Hey, Dad, just checking on you. How's the car coming along?" He asked that one more time than I could stand. I kept my answers short, pretending nothing had changed. Once he mentioned Claire casually. She was thinking we could all have dinner soon, make peace. "Peace," I repeated. "That's a big word, Daniel. What are we making peace for?" He laughed nervously, the sound forced. "You know, just family things. She feels bad about the other night." "I'm sure she does," I said quietly. "Guilt can be heavy when you're carrying stolen things." He went silent, then changed the subject. I didn't push. Not yet. The longer he talked, the more he revealed without realizing. Each conversation confirmed what I already suspected: Daniel was drowning, and Claire kept promising she'd teach him to swim while tying weights to his ankles. By the end of the week, I had hours of recordings, a handful of notes, and a calmness that felt unnatural. I should have been furious, but fury burns fast. What I needed was endurance. Helen's voice came back to me, the one she used when we were designing together late at night. Measure twice, act once. That became my mantra. On Friday, I decided to test the boundaries. I called Daniel. Son, I began, I found a letter from the bank. Something about refinancing. Is there something you want to tell me? There was a pause, the kind that stretches too long. Oh, that he said, finally, voice too quick, too rehearsed. It's nothing serious, Dad. Just a clerical mix-up. I'll handle it. Of course, I said. You're good at handling things. When we hung up, I stared at the phone, my reflection faint in the black screen. There it was again, the same lie wrapped in charm, just like Claire's family. But I wasn't going to confront him with anger. Not yet. That's what they'd expect. Instead, I wrote another entry in the journal, test initiated. Subject unaware. Greed smells the same in every generation. The next day, I backed up the recordings onto a flash drive and tucked it inside the glove compartment of the Porsche beside Helen's blueprints. The car had become my safe, my sanctuary, and my confessional. Every time I worked on it, I felt closer to her, stronger, quieter, more deliberate. That evening, I stood in front of her photo in the garage, the soft hum of the radio filling the air with one of her favorite piano pieces. The letter she'd written, "Don't let them break your spine," sat framed on the shelf. I looked at it then, at the pile of notes I'd gathered, and a small, bitter smile crept across my face. "You always knew they'd test me," I whispered, "and now I know how to pass." I'd always believed that silence could build walls strong enough to keep fools out, but that week taught me something else. Silence also lets them think they've won. By the time Claire's invitation arrived, written in gold cursive on heavy cream paper, I knew exactly what she was planning. The Bennett Foundation Charity Gala, it read, followed by an unnecessary line in italics, formal attire required. Daniel's handwriting on the envelope told me he'd sent it, but Claire's words were behind every letter. It wasn't an invitation. It was a performance notice. I placed the card on my workbench beside Helen's letters. The garage was quiet except for the radio humming softly. The Porsche gleamed faintly under the light gold paint catching the early afternoon sun. I picked up a small notepad and tore out a sheet. With a pencil, I wrote a sentence Helen had once said while polishing the side mirror of this very car. "A mirror never lies. It only shows what you've become." I taped the note to the mirror, then stood back and looked at my reflection. The face staring back wasn't broken, just older, creased, calm, deliberate. I smiled faintly. "Let's see what they've become," I said to the empty air, grabbed my coat and left. The Bennett mansion looked like it was trying too hard to be admired. Spotlights lined the driveway, bouncing off imported marble columns. Valets in black suits rushed back and forth, parking cars worth more than my house. A string quartet played near the fountain while servers carried trays of champagne that no one really wanted but everyone accepted. I arrived early as requested. Claire had written a special note at the bottom of the invitation. "Please come early, Edward. We might need a hand setting up." The words had made me laugh when I first read them, though. The sound came out bitter. Tonight I'd let them think they were in control. Inside, the scent of roses and perfume hung thick in the air. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like they were competing for attention. I found Claire near the staircase, surrounded by a cluster of guests. Her red dress caught the light with every turn, carefully chosen to match the gleaming red Porsche parked outside the ballroom windows. Even from a distance, I recognized the car's shape. It was a near-perfect twin to the one in my garage, except where mine was deep gold, this one screamed for applause. "Edward," she called out, her smile as polished as the silver in her hand. "You made it," I said I would, I replied. "I keep my word." How wonderful. She gave me the kind of pat on the arm reserved for waiters who've brought the right dish. The staff could use some help setting the table near the back. "You don't mind, do you?" "Not at all," I said, meeting her eyes. "I've always believed a good table deserves to be set properly." Her smile flickered just slightly before she turned back to her guests. As I walked toward the dining area, I caught Daniel's gaze across the room. He looked uneasy, trapped between two worlds, the one that bore his last name and the one he'd married into. I nodded to him. He looked away. The back of the ballroom was warm from the kitchen nearby. Waiters moved in and out, carrying plates, whispering about deadlines and camera schedules. I found an empty chair near the swinging doors and sat down. From there, I could see everything without being seen. The red Porsche outside was the centerpiece of the evening. Through the tall glass windows, its paint shimmered under a halo of spotlights. Guests wandered by to take photos, believing it was Claire's pride and joy. I overheard one man say, "She really knows how to live, doesn't she? That's the new Turbo S." I had to bite back a laugh. The car was rented, of course. I'd seen the dealership's emblem faintly glinting on the keychain she flaunted earlier. Dinner began an hour later, the orchestra softening to background noise as the guests filled their seats. My place card was nowhere near the long marble table. Instead, a server guided me toward a small round table tucked near the kitchen door. I could feel the heat from the ovens, smell the roast duck long before it reached the guests. Every time a waiter pushed through the door, the flap brushed against my shoulder. I smiled to myself. "Helping set up," she'd said. I suppose that included sitting with the hired staff. When the speeches started, I watched from the shadows. Harold spoke first, proud and booming about legacy and vision. Then Claire took the microphone, her voice sweet and rehearsed. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate generosity, the kind that changes lives." She paused dramatically. "And we couldn't do it without the love and support of our family." Her eyes found mine briefly before drifting away, pretending I wasn't there. "Some people show their love through quiet service," she added, letting the words hang long enough for her circle to laugh politely. The guests clinked their glasses. I didn't. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. Helen's words echoed softly in my mind, "Speak when it matters." "Not yet," I told her. "Your time wasn't right." A hush fell over the room as the double doors opened. Two men rolled in a red velvet curtain that covered the ballroom's far wall. Cameras turned toward the stage. Bright lights flared. Claire's voice rose with excitement. And now she announced the highlight of the evening, our latest addition, a symbol of success and sophistication. The crowd leaned forward. The Porsche 911 Turbo S. Applause thundered through the room. Guests stood to get a better view, some holding up their phones to film. The curtain dropped, revealing the red Porsche outside, under the glow of spotlights polished to perfection. Claire raised her glass toward the car like a queen blessing her throne. I stayed seated near the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator behind me steady as my heartbeat. I could see her reflection in the window, smiling, radiant, convinced that everything around her was real. For a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. Then I noticed the camera crew moving into position, their lights turning the scene into a stage. Claire turned toward them, her voice carrying across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, success isn't inherited, it's earned. And tonight we celebrate ours." I leaned back in my chair, the corners of my mouth lifting. Outside, the cameras began recording as Claire proudly introduced the red Porsche to her guests. The applause still rang in the air, echoing off glass and marble like the aftershock of something hollow. I watched from my corner near the kitchen as Claire basked in it, the cameras catching her every angle, every laugh, rehearsed down to the tilt of her chin. The red Porsche glowed under the spotlights outside its paint, screaming in the dark. Guests swarmed closer to the windows, murmuring admiration, envy, disbelief, all the emotions she collected like trophies. I stood there, hands at my sides, feeling that quiet burn of clarity Helen had left me with. A mirror never lies. It only shows what you've become. The words I'd written that morning waited for me back in the garage, but now they echoed louder inside my head. A waiter brushed past me, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He hesitated, unsure where to go next. "Let me take that," I said, and before he could argue, I took the tray and stepped forward. My heart was steady. The din of laughter dimmed as I crossed the ballroom, the weight of 12 glasses trembling only slightly with each step. Claire saw me approaching, and her smile sharpened, curious, annoyed. I stopped a few feet away from her and raised my voice just enough to cut through the chatter. "A toast to success," I said, my tone smooth, almost pleasant. Conversations faltered. The quartet quieted. Claire turned toward me fully, her hand resting delicately on Harold's arm. Her eyes narrowed, gleaming with that cruel humor she wore so easily. "Even trash knows how to serve," she said loud enough for the guests nearest her to hear. Laughter rippled through them like wind over glass. I smiled. Not wide, not bitter, just enough for her to see I'd heard her and chosen not to care. I lifted one of the flutes from the tray and held it to the light. The bubbles rose slow and deliberate, reflecting gold. "To knowing the difference between real and fake," I said. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure if they'd missed the joke. Claire blinked, her composure flickering for the first time. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone slipping. I nodded toward the window. "Why don't we find out?" At first, the sound was faint, a low hum of an engine rolling up the driveway. Then the golden light spilled across the polished floor as the real Porsche 911 Turbo S came into view. Heads turned. Guests pressed closer to the glass. The car slowed its headlights, slicing through the shadows, and stopped beside the red one. Claire's laugh broke brittle. "What is this?" she said, her voice higher now. Another rental, but she already knew. I could see it in the way her eyes darted from the gold paint to the license plate gleaming under the lights. Helen. 1. The guests murmured, confused, curious. Harold took a step forward, frowning. The engine purred, once powerful but composed. The headlights of the gold Porsche flicked on, illuminating the red car beside it, which remained still and silent, its rented perfection suddenly cheap in comparison. Through the windshield of the gold car, I saw Daniel in the driver's seat. His face was pale, tight, but his eyes met mine for the first time in weeks. He nodded, once a small gesture that said everything it needed to. He'd brought it here himself. Maybe guilt had pushed him, or maybe the truth finally had. Either way, he was part of this moment now. I turned back to Claire, who stood frozen, her hand trembling around the stem of her glass. Her reflection in the ballroom window looked like a stranger, a woman caught between her own lies and the glare of the truth. "Sorry, Claire," I said softly, but my voice carried. "Real gold doesn't need to shout." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The laughter died. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the gold engine outside. A few of the guests looked from me to the car, piecing together what was happening. The realization spread through the crowd like dawn creeping over dark hills. Cameras turned toward the windows. The red Porsche's rented glamour meant nothing now. The gold one gleamed steady and real, the way truth always does when it finally steps into the light. Claire tried to recover. "This is ridiculous," she said, forcing a laugh. "Daniel, what on earth are you doing?" But Daniel didn't answer. He turned off the engine and stepped out, the click of the car door loud in the quiet. The reporters outside surged forward, flashes igniting like fireworks. One of them shouted, "Is that your car, ma'am?" Claire's painted smile cracked. "Of course it's ours," she snapped. "You think—" She stopped mid-sentence as Daniel reached into his jacket and held up the keys, the gold crest of the manufacturer catching the light. He tossed them once into the air and caught them again before walking to my side. The room gasped. "Actually," he said, his voice steady but strained, "it's his." I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The truth was doing all the work now. The guests began whispering the way people do when they realize they've been clapping for the wrong performance. The same journalists who'd come to photograph Claire's success now turned their cameras on her, unraveling. Her hand tightened around her champagne glass until it shattered, the sound sharp and desperate. I placed the tray down on the nearest table, every glass still upright. Then I walked toward the window, stopping beside her. "The thing about mirrors," I said quietly enough for only her to hear, "is that they don't lie no matter how much money you spend polishing them." She stared at me, mouth open, words lost somewhere between pride and panic. Outside, Daniel leaned against the gold Porsche, the headlights still cutting through the darkness, illuminating the red one beside it like a fraud caught in confession. A flash went off, then another. I heard reporters shouting questions, guests murmuring about ownership and forgery and embarrassment. The orchestra had stopped playing. Even Harold, normally the loudest in any room, said nothing. I straightened my tie, glanced at the chaos around me, and turned to leave. Behind me, the reflection of the two cars shimmered in the window, one real, one fake, truth and pretense locked side by side. I walked past the stunned faces, the whispers rising like smoke, and out into the night air. The cameras followed, flashes stinging my eyes as I stepped onto the marble steps. I could hear Claire's voice behind me, shrill and desperate, trying to reclaim control that was already gone. The crowd outside had gathered, their phones raised, recording every second. I didn't stop. The gold Porsche waited, quiet and dignified. Daniel opened the driver's door for me, his expression wordless but changed. I got in, started the engine, and felt the hum vibrate through my chest. As I pulled away, I saw the reflection of the red car fading behind us in the mirrors, its shine already dying under the weight of truth. The crowd froze, the reporters kept filming, and by the next morning the video was everywhere. By sunrise, the world already knew. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing over and over on the nightstand, messages pouring in from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Friends, former co-workers, even neighbors I hadn't spoken to since Helen's funeral, all sending the same link. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. The night before, I'd seen the flash of cameras, the crowd of phones raised like torches. The video had gone viral. The headline on one message preview said it all: "Father-in-law exposes fake Porsche at Bennett charity gala." I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window, the glow from my phone reflecting off the mug. The video played automatically muted at first. The images alone told the story: Claire's face frozen mid-laugh, Daniel standing by the gold Porsche, me holding the champagne tray like a man who'd been underestimated one time too many. I turned on the sound. The crowd's laughter at her expense hit louder than any insult I'd endured at that table weeks earlier. Comments scrolled beneath the video faster than I could read them. Instant karma. That old man's a legend. Real gold doesn't need to shout best line ever. I should have felt satisfaction, but I didn't. Vindication is a strange companion. It fills the room for a moment, and then leaves behind the echo of something lonelier. I watched the video once more, this time noticing Daniel's face when he handed me the keys. There was guilt there, yes, but also relief. Maybe redemption starts with one honest act. I hoped so. By noon, local news outlets had picked up the story. The Bennett's red disaster ran one headline. Charity gala turns into family feud, said another. Clips of Claire's frozen expression filled the morning broadcasts, replayed between segments about weather and sports scores. Talk show hosts joked about fake fortunes and real class. The Bennetts had spent decades cultivating an image of perfection, and now the cracks were national news. I didn't leave the house that day. I didn't have to. The world came knocking in its own way. A reporter left a note on my porch, asking for comment. Another called the garage phone 3 times before giving up. I ignored them all. Helen had always warned me that fame, even accidental fame, was a thief of peace. That evening, I turned on the television and saw Harold Bennett at a press conference outside his company headquarters. Cameras flashed as he read from a prepared statement, his jaw clenched so tightly that his words sounded like gravel. "These rumors circulating online are malicious misrepresentations," he said. "The Bennetts have always upheld integrity, generosity, and respect. We will not tolerate this attack on our family's reputation." The clip cut to a reporter shouting, "Mr. Bennett, is it true the Porsche was rented?" His eyes flared. I said no further questions. He stepped into a black SUV and slammed the door. I watched the screen, sipping coffee gone cold, and I knew what would come next. Men like Harold don't recover from humiliation, they retaliate. That kind of pride doesn't bend. It breaks and cuts everything nearby on the way down. 2 days later, Daniel called. "Dad, things are getting out of hand," he said. His voice was small, stretched thin. "Claire hasn't stopped crying. Her parents are furious. Reporters are at their gate." "Actions have consequences, son," I said. "You know that better than anyone." He sighed. "Harold says you planned this, that you set her up." "Did I?" There was a long pause. "I don't think so," he said finally. "But he does. And he's angry, Dad. I mean really angry. He's talking about lawyers, investigations. He said he's going to ruin you." I glanced at the golden Porsche parked outside the garage window, its surface catching the fading light. "Tell him good luck," I said, and hung up. By the next morning, I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. Black sedan, tinted windows, too new for the neighborhood. The same car appeared the next day too. Once, when I stepped outside, the window rolled down just enough for a cigarette to flicker, then it drove off. I didn't need a guess to know who had sent them. Harold's pride had money and paranoia to spend. Later that week, a man came into my garage pretending to need a brake inspection. His questions had nothing to do with cars. "You've had this shop a while, huh? Good business." His eyes wandered too much. His hands were too clean. He left after 10 minutes, but I watched him check the street name twice before pulling away. The phone started ringing again, numbers I didn't recognize. One voice claimed to be from the IRS, another from the city zoning office. Each call asked oddly specific questions about my taxes, my licenses, my finances. I wrote the dates and names down in my Helen journal. Every pattern tells a story if you're patient enough to trace it. By the weekend, the news cycle had shifted, but the Bennett's shame still lingered online. Memes, reaction videos, late-night jokes, it was all entertainment to strangers, but to Harold it was a declaration of war. His empire had built its foundation on reputation, and I had cracked it with one sentence and a gold car. That Sunday evening, I drove into town for groceries. On the magazine rack near the checkout, I saw Claire's face printed under the headline, "From Glamour to Guilt, the Fall of the Bennett Heiress." She looked like a statue, beautiful, lifeless, trapped. I didn't buy the magazine, but I stood there long enough to feel a flicker of pity. She'd built her life out of mirrors, and now she was watching them all shatter. When I got home, another envelope waited in my mailbox, but this one wasn't from the bank. It was thick, plain, with no return address. Inside was a stack of glossy photos. Me leaving my house, me locking up the garage, me buying groceries. A note on top read, "We're watching." I stared at it for a long time, then placed it gently on the workbench beside Helen's letters. I'd expected it eventually. People like Harold only understand pressure, and they think everyone else will break under it the same way they would. I poured a drink and sat by the window, watching the porch light flicker over the driveway. Somewhere out there, Harold Bennett was pacing his office, planning, shouting, losing the one thing he valued most: control. I could almost hear him the way he'd sounded on that stage, his voice cracking beneath his own arrogance. I raised my glass to the quiet house and whispered, "You're losing faster than you think, Harold." And somewhere in that mansion of mirrors, his voice finally broke through the distance. If he wants a war, he'll get one. When a man like Harold Bennett says the word war, what he really means is panic. He'd spent decades building his empire on illusion money, moving in circles, favors traded like poker chips, but humiliation had shaken him in ways he couldn't hide. I could see it in the headlines, the desperate press releases, the hollow smiles on television. He wanted control back. What he didn't realize was that control is a currency too, and he'd already spent it all. For a week, I waited. The car with tinted windows still appeared across from my house, the same investigator watching for something worth selling. I gave him nothing. Instead, I began to dig, not with shovels or rumors, but with records. Harold had always been loud about his success, but quiet about his methods. It didn't take long to find what I suspected: a trail of shell companies registered under names that didn't exist before his last fundraiser. Money in, money out, the same investors listed on multiple ledgers. It was small by corporate scandal standards, but big enough to ruin him. The kind of fraud that looked clean until someone with authority decided to look closer. That's when I made a call to an old contact, Jonathan Price, a man I'd worked with 20 years ago on a federal energy contract. Back then, he was a quiet compliance officer. Now he was a senior investigator with the Federal Banking Commission. "Jonathan," I said, "I think I've found a man laundering pride into dollars. He's about to make a deal that could be of interest to your department." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Edward Miller." "I haven't heard that name in years. Send me what you've got." I did. The next morning, Jonathan called back. "You're right," he said. "We've had eyes on Bennett's accounts for months, but nothing concrete. He's careful until now." "You think he'd meet a new investor? He'll meet anyone who flatters him," I said. "Then let's give him one." 2 days later, I attended a private brunch at the Bennett's mansion, invited miraculously by Claire herself. Her message had been short and sweet: "Let's talk." I suppose she thought extending an olive branch would make her look magnanimous. When I arrived, she greeted me with a forced smile. "Edward, I think we all want to move past the misunderstanding," she said. "My father's looking for new partners. Perhaps you could introduce someone from your engineering circles." Her tone was light, but her eyes were desperate. I nodded. "I might know a man. Someone old money private, looking for investment opportunities in energy and real estate." Harold's interest perked up immediately. "Old money, you say? Private, I like private." "His name's John Pierce," I said. "He's discreet, but he appreciates legacy. You two might get along." We arranged the meeting for Friday morning at Harold's downtown office. I made sure the introductions went smoothly. Jonathan, now Mr. Pierce, played the part flawlessly, wearing a tailored suit and speaking in the slow, measured confidence of wealth. Harold bragged about his exclusive fund, dropping hints about returns that no legitimate business could promise. I sat quietly in the corner, playing the role of harmless middleman, nodding at all the right moments. At one point, Harold leaned across the table and said, "Now, Mr. Pierce, this is off the record, of course. We move money efficiently. Clients appreciate anonymity. You understand." Jonathan smiled, sliding a sleek folder toward him. Of course. I always appreciate efficiency. Harold signed without hesitation. He didn't even read the full document. His pride was too loud for caution. Claire sat beside him, watching her fingers drumming on the table. When the pen left the paper, Jonathan closed the folder, slowly stood and said, "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. This concludes our business. I just need to make one quick call." Harold frowned. A call about what? Jonathan's tone shifted, calm but official. "About the warrant we've just executed." The office door opened and 4 federal agents entered, their jackets flashing the letters that froze every drop of blood in the room: FBI. One of them read Harold his rights as another collected the signed documents. Claire gasped, standing up so fast her chair clattered backward. "What is this? What's going on?" Harold's face went red, veins pulsing at his temple. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "Yes, we can," Jonathan said evenly. "Mr. Bennett, you've just admitted to bank fraud and misrepresentation of investor funds in front of federal witnesses. I suggest you stay calm." Claire turned on me, eyes wild. "You set us up." I met her gaze steady and unflinching. "No. I gave you a choice. You chose greed." Her mouth opened, then closed again, no words left to fill the space between us. Harold tried to stand, shouting something about lawyers and misunderstandings, but the cuffs clicked around his wrists before he could finish. The sound was small but final, like the snap of a door lock in an empty house. Outside, the press had gathered. I didn't need to ask how they always smell scandal before the ink dries. The agents led Harold down the steps as cameras flashed, reporters shouting questions that tangled into a blur of noise. "Mr. Bennett, are you being charged? Is it true your daughter forged documents? Who is Edward Miller?" Claire followed behind, pale and shaking. One of the microphones caught her voice as she whispered to no one in particular. "This can't be happening." I stood at the edge of the crowd, unseen. The winter light caught the silver in Harold's hair as he was placed in the back of the black SUV. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look powerful. He looked small. As the vehicles pulled away, I took out my notebook and wrote one simple line beneath my last entry. "Justice doesn't shout either." I closed it, slipped it into my coat pocket, and started walking back toward the garage. The air felt lighter than it had in months. When I reached the car, I looked up at the evening sky, soft gray, thin streaks of sunlight breaking through clouds, and I thought of Helen. "You'd have liked that one," I said quietly. "Quick, clean, and fair." Behind me, the TV vans began to roll footage for the evening news, their headlines already forming in my mind. The story would travel fast: Bennett empire collapses in federal fraud scandal. It would be poetic in a way, the same public stage where they'd once mocked me, now broadcasting their downfall. As the last car door shut and the sirens faded, I could still hear Claire's voice in my memory, sharp and broken, cutting through the chaos. "You set us up, and mine calm as ever. No, I gave you a choice. You chose greed." The agents' radios crackled, cameras clicked, and somewhere in that chorus of noise, Harold Bennett's empire crumbled into silence. He was handcuffed in front of the press, and Claire stood frozen, the reflection of everything she'd lost, shimmering in the glass doors behind her. The day after Harold's arrest, the news wouldn't stop. Every channel carried his face, every headline used the same words: fraud, scandal, disgrace. I didn't watch for long. Justice had been served, and that was enough for me. Still, there was one person I knew I hadn't seen the last of. By evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, and the garage filled with the soft hum of the radio, I heard the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. I didn't have to look to know it was Daniel. The engine cut off, followed by the hesitant sound of footsteps on gravel. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite crossing the threshold. The porch light cast his shadow long across the floor. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that didn't come from years but from the weight of shame. "Dad," he said, finally, voice low, rough around the edges. "Can I come in?" I nodded toward the workbench. Doors open. It always was. He stepped inside slowly, eyes darting around the garage as though it were a museum of his own guilt. His gaze lingered on the Porsche, on the golden glow of its paint catching the lamplight. "You finished it," he said softly. I kept my focus on the engine tightening, a bolt that didn't really need tightening. "It was never broken," I said. "Just waiting for someone to treat it right." Daniel swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. Dad, I have to tell you something. Everything that happened, the loan, the papers, it was me. I signed your name. Claire said it was just for show, that we'd pay it back once the promotion came through. She said her parents would take care of it. I wanted to believe her. He rubbed his face with both hands, his voice cracking. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. I thought if I just went along with her, she'd stop looking at me like I was. Less. I put the wrench down and turned to face him. Less than what, Daniel? He looked at me, eyes red. Less than them. Less than enough. I nodded slowly. And now, he laughed once bitterly. Now, I see I was never even in their league. They used me and I let them. His voice faltered. I let her talk me into betraying my own father. I took a step closer, studying the son I'd raised, the man I'd almost lost. His shoulders slumped like a child caught in a lie too big to hide. Do you finally see who she turned you into? I asked. Daniel's lip trembled. Yeah, he said quietly. A coward. No, I said. Just someone who forgot who taught him better. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm so sorry, Dad. For everything. If I could take it back, I would. I let the silence stretch between us until it felt like something real again. Then, I nodded once. Regret's only worth something if you use it. You want to make it right, help me fix what's left. He looked confused. What do you mean? The bank still thinks I authorized that loan. It'll take paperwork calls and a few lawyers who actually know the difference between right and convenient. You used my name to start the mess. You can use your hands to help clean it up. Daniel nodded, determination soft but growing. I'll do whatever it takes. For the next hour, we sat side by side at the workbench, sorting through documents and copies of the forged forms. Daniel took notes as I explained what we'd need: affidavits, verification, requests the right people to contact at the credit office. Every so often I'd catch him glancing at Helen's photo on the shelf, as though silently asking for forgiveness from someone who'd never stopped believing in him. At one point he said, I don't know how you can even look at me after what I did. Because you're still my son, I said. And because you came back. The radio played softly in the background, a piano piece Helen used to love. I could almost hear her humming along the sound, weaving through the quiet like forgiveness itself. For the first time in years, Daniel stayed past dark. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. Do you think she'd be proud of me? Not for what I did, but for trying to fix it. I met his eyes. I think she'd say, you're finally remembering who you are. After he drove away, the house felt lighter, though I knew the work ahead would be anything but easy. I poured a small glass of whiskey, the one I kept for nights when reflection came easier than sleep, and sat back down at the workbench. Helen's letters were stacked neatly beside the notebook where I kept my entries. For weeks I'd left one envelope untouched, afraid of what it might say. It was labeled in her familiar handwriting, open when someone asks for forgiveness. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. The paper had yellowed just a little with age, but her words on the front were as clear as the day she'd written them. I slid my finger under the flap and felt the faint scent of her perfume escape into the air. The garage was silent except for the sound of the seal giving way. I unfolded the letter slowly, eyes catching on the first line before I even breathed it aloud. And in that moment, with the night quiet around me and the weight of everything that had happened pressing against my chest, I realized Helen had been waiting for this one, for him, for me, for both of us. The words stared up at me in her steady handwriting, and I whispered into the stillness. You always knew when to speak, didn't you? Then I began to read what she'd left behind. Helen's letter stayed with me long after I finished reading it. Her words were simple, steady the way she'd always been. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it completes it. I carried that line with me in the days that followed. The newspapers called the Bennett case the fall of an empire, but for me it felt more like the quiet balancing of a long overdue scale. When the announcement came that their assets would be auctioned to repay debts, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure approaching. The auction was held in the downtown Civic Hall, a wide, echoing space filled with more journalists than bidders. Reporters huddled near the stage, their whispers sharp as camera shutters. Rows of polished chairs faced a podium where the auctioneer shuffled papers, his voice rehearsing figures under his breath. The air smelled faintly of paper perfume and something sterile like the aftermath of a storm. I arrived early, sitting near the back. I didn't need attention. The red Porsche sat on display near the entrance, its paint dulled by dust and storage. The same car Claire had paraded at her gala, now stripped of polish, looked smaller under the fluorescent light. A white tag hung from the rear-view mirror, Lot 27. I paused by it for a moment, tracing a finger along the door. Even imitation once admired turns ordinary when truth arrives. The room filled quickly. Investors, bankers, and curious onlookers whispered about the scandal that had made the Bennetts a household name for all the wrong reasons. Toward the front row, I spotted Claire. She looked thinner, her hair pulled back tightly, a pale contrast to the crimson dress she'd once worn for the cameras. She didn't see me. Her gaze stayed fixed on the stage, her hands folded in her lap, a faint tremor in her fingers. The auction began with furniture, art, jewelry, remnants of a family that had built its image on things that shined. The prices rose quickly at first, then fell as buyers grew weary. When the red Porsche came up, there was polite laughter from a few bidders. The auctioneer's voice rose, Lot 27, Porsche 911 Turbo S, formerly owned by the Bennett family. Opening bid at $50,000. The room fell quiet. Finally, a collector in the back raised his paddle. It sold for less than the price of one of Claire's old gowns. When the final gavel dropped, the auctioneer cleared his throat. Before we conclude today's event, he said, we have a final unexpected addition to the program. He gestured toward me. Mr. Edward Miller has requested to address the floor. Every head turned. Cameras shifted. I rose slowly, my steps echoing as I made my way to the front. I wasn't dressed like a businessman, no tailored suit, no gold cufflinks, just a dark jacket, clean and pressed, the kind of attire Helen would have approved of. I nodded to the auctioneer, who stepped aside. Good afternoon, I began. My voice carried easily in the silence. I didn't come here to buy or to gloat. I came to sell something of my own, a piece of work that began in this very town in a small garage years before any of you cared who the Bennetts were. I reached into my briefcase and placed a folder on the podium. This is the original patent for the lithium battery design my wife Helen Miller and I developed. Some of you drive cars powered by its early prototypes. It was her genius, not mine, that made it possible. A murmur swept the crowd. I continued. Today I'm auctioning this patent not for profit but for purpose. The proceeds will not line my pockets. They will build a legacy worthy of her name. I paused, letting the silence settle. The Helen Bennett Scholarship for Women in Engineering. The name rippled through the crowd like a sudden current. Claire's head lifted sharply. Her eyes met mine for the first time since that night at the gala. I saw confusion there, then disbelief, then something softer, something like sorrow. The auctioneer cleared his throat, sensing the moment. We'll open bidding for the Miller battery patent at $10 million. Hands shot up immediately. Tesla's representative raised first. 10 million. A second paddle followed Ford's liaison. 12. The numbers climbed 15, 20, 30, each bid like a heartbeat thundering in the room. Cameras flashed as tension turned to awe. At 40 million, the crowd began to applaud. At 47 million, Tesla's bidder raised the final hand. The gavel fell with a single resonant crack. Sold, the auctioneer announced, for $47 million. The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling like a wave. I stepped back to the microphone. All proceeds, I said, clearly go to the Helen Bennett Scholarship so that young women with bright minds and humble beginnings can finish the work my wife started. I let my gaze find Claire again. And so no one forgets that true worth isn't inherited, it's earned. She was crying before I finished the sentence. Not the delicate tears of sympathy or guilt, but the quiet, shaking kind that come when a truth lands deeper than pride can reach. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shoulders trembling. Reporters turned their cameras toward her, the lenses catching everything. The woman who once mocked humility now bowed beneath it. The applause grew louder. Some people stood. The auctioneer clapped too, his voice breaking slightly as he announced the close of the event. I stepped away from the podium, feeling the room shift as though something long locked in place had finally moved. As I walked toward the exit, the echoes followed me, the sound of hands meeting the hum of cameras, the murmur of names. But all I could hear was Helen's voice, soft and steady, somewhere in the back of my mind. Real gold doesn't need to shout. I turned one last time before leaving. Claire sat with her face in her hands, the light from the stage falling across her like absolution. The cameras caught it the moment pride gave way to humility. The applause rose again, and as it filled the hall, I stepped out into the evening light, knowing the story was no longer mine alone. Inside, the crowd stood to honor what Helen had built. Outside, I breathed in the quiet and the sound of her name carried on the wind. The morning after the auction, I woke to a world that seemed quieter. For the first time in months, no one was calling, no reporters were waiting at the gate, no shadows lingered across the street. The air felt lighter, like the storm had finally passed. Still, the headlines found their way to me. Every paper carried a version of the same story. Edward Miller turns family scandal into legacy. The man who chose mercy from revenge to redemption. My name, my wife's name, the scholarship's name, they were everywhere. Helen Bennett Scholarship. I smiled at the thought that she would have found that irony amusing. The phone rang all day. Producers, journalists, even university deans. They all wanted interviews, statements, quotes about forgiveness and morality, the kind of sound bites they could package into 10 seconds of inspiration for the evening news. I said no to every one of them. When a reporter asked why, I gave him the only answer that felt right. Justice is loud enough, I said. I'll stay quiet. He didn't understand, but Helen would have. By afternoon, I was back in the garage cleaning the workbench. The Porsche sat silent, its gold body catching the sunlight streaming through the half-open door. It wasn't a weapon anymore, or even armor. It was a memory, a monument. Daniel arrived just after 3, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes clearer than I'd seen in years. He'd been helping with the legal paperwork, coordinating with the lawyers to ensure the scholarship fund was registered correctly. I watched him move around the space comfortable again, like the boy who used to hand me tools while asking 1,000 questions about circuits and engines. They're calling you a hero, he said, setting a folder down. I'm no hero, I replied. I just stopped pretending other people's lies were the truth. He nodded slowly, looking down at the floor. You could have kept the money, you know. No one would have blamed you. I didn't want the money, I said. I wanted peace. He smiled faintly. Well, I think Mom would have been proud. That sentence lingered in the air. We worked quietly after that, organizing documents, sorting the last of Helen's blueprints. When I reached for the small wooden box, the one that had held her letters, Daniel noticed something I'd stopped thinking about. He pointed at the remaining envelope tucked at the bottom. That one's still sealed, he said. I picked it up. The paper was softer now, its edges worn from being handled so many times without ever being opened. Helen's handwriting had faded just slightly, but the words were still clear. Open when you forgive. Daniel sat down beside me, his voice low. What do you think she meant? I turned the envelope over in my hands. Knowing her, I said she meant exactly what she wrote. Nothing more, nothing less. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You think it's about Claire, maybe, I said. Or maybe it's about me. He frowned, confused. You've already forgiven her, haven't you? I don't know, I admitted. Forgiveness isn't something you declare. It's something you realize after the noise stops. I looked down at the envelope again, and the noise is only just starting to fade. Daniel was quiet for a while. Then he said softly, I wish I'd known her the way you did. You did, I told him. You just forgot for a while. We sat in silence. Outside, a soft wind moved through the trees, and the smell of rain drifted in through the open window. I thought about all that had happened, the humiliation, the lies, the long, slow climb back towards something that resembled grace. I thought about Helen's voice in those letters, her steady wisdom guiding me through every stage of anger until there was nothing left to burn. And now here was the final test, the one that didn't come with instructions. I stood and walked to the workbench, setting the envelope down beside the framed photo of her. She was smiling in that picture, the same quiet smile she wore when she knew something I didn't. Daniel came to stand beside me. You going to open it? He asked. Eventually, I said. Not yet. He nodded, respecting the pause. He stayed for dinner that night. We ate simply grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, the kind of meal Helen used to make when she wanted to remind us that enough was plenty. When he left, the house felt full for the first time in years. I washed the dishes, turned off the lights, and went back to the garage. The letter sat waiting in the soft pool of light from the desk lamp. I picked it up again, tracing my thumb over the seal. For months, these envelopes had given me direction when I had none. But this one felt like an ending, or maybe a beginning. I thought about Claire, wherever she was now. I thought about Harold in his cell, Daniel rebuilding piece by piece what he'd nearly destroyed. Forgiveness, Helen's last word. I took a deep breath, my heart steady, my mind quiet. Then, with the sound of the rain beginning to tap against the windows, I slid a finger under the flap. For a moment I hesitated, afraid of what her voice would ask of me one last time. The lamp flickered once and I smiled at the timing. She'd always had a way of showing up when I needed her most. I held the letter, closed the paper warm from my hands, and whispered to the empty air, "All right, Helen, I'm ready to listen." And then slowly, carefully, I began to open it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded Helen's final letter. The ink had faded in places, but her handwriting was as sure and deliberate as the woman herself. I read the first line aloud, my voice low enough to barely stir the air. "Forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it completes it." I stopped and let the words sink in. The garage seemed to hold its breath. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm, tapping gently against the windows like a metronome marking time. Her letter went on in that same calm, wise tone that had once filled every corner of our home. "Edward," she wrote, "if you're reading this, you've already fought your hardest battle. I don't know who hurt you or how deeply, but I know you. You'll seek truth, and you'll find it. But don't let justice harden into bitterness. Forgiveness is not surrender, it's release. It's what keeps your heart from becoming what broke it." I read those lines over and over until they stopped being words and became something like a pulse. I could almost hear her voice again, that quiet certainty that had always steadied me when the world felt unkind. I set the letter down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of the garage. The light flickered once, and I smiled. "You always get the last word, don't you?" It would have been easy to leave things where they stood, to end the story at justice, at victory. But Helen's words had a way of turning ease into questions I couldn't ignore. I thought of Claire, of that moment in the auction hall when her face crumbled beneath the weight of her own choices. She had been cruel, selfish, and blind, yes, but beneath all that she'd been human. And Helen had never believed in wasted souls. "Forgiveness doesn't erase justice," she'd said. "It completes it." Maybe justice had already spoken, but forgiveness still had something left to say. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the stationery I used for the scholarship foundation. The paper was thick, off-white, embossed with Helen's initials. For a long moment I just stared at the blank page, unsure what to write. Then slowly the words came. "Claire," I began, "Helen left me 12 letters, each one for a different moment in life: loss, anger, betrayal, love. The last one was for forgiveness. I thought about keeping it to myself, but she wouldn't have wanted that. So I'm sending it to you because maybe it's meant for both of us." I paused, listening to the rain, then continued. "You've lost more than money, more than reputation. You've lost what you once mistook for worth. Maybe that's a gift in disguise." Helen believed everyone deserved one chance to start again, even those who never gave her husband one. When I finished writing, I folded the letter carefully and placed it into a cream-colored envelope. Then I reached for my checkbook. The scholarship fund's balance was fresh from the auction proceeds, $47 million of Helen's legacy waiting to do good. I wrote the amount, slowly, deliberately, $50,000. In the memo line I wrote, "For a fresh start." On the workbench, I found an old photograph, one the news had captured during the gala, showing Claire standing beside the rented red Porsche, smiling at her own reflection. Someone had sent it to me in the early days of the scandal, maybe to mock her, maybe to provoke me. I'd kept it without knowing why. Now I understood. I slipped the photograph into the envelope with the letter and the check. On the back of the photo I wrote a single line: "The moment you chose appearances over truth." I sealed the envelope and sat there, the weight of it resting in my palm. For all its simplicity, it felt heavier than any revenge I'd ever planned. I could almost hear Helen again, the warmth in her voice, softening the edges of my stubbornness. "You can't change people, Edward, but you can show them what it means to change." The clock ticked past midnight before I finally stood. I addressed the envelope in steady handwriting, "Claire Bennett." No return name, no need for one. The act itself was enough. I placed it on the hall table where the morning mail would be collected. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the air clean and still. I went back to the garage one last time before bed. The Porsche gleamed faintly under the single light bulb, quiet and golden, a mirror of everything that had been broken and rebuilt. On the workbench, Helen's open letter lay beside her framed photograph, her eyes seeming to follow me as I wrote the last line on a small note card and slipped it into the envelope before sealing it shut. My pen moved slowly, the words forming without hesitation this time. "Use it wisely." Or, prove us wrong again. I pressed the seal closed, set the letter beside the outgoing mail, and turned off the light. The house settled into silence. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't need applause. It just needed to be sent. A few weeks passed after I mailed the envelope, and life settled into something that felt like peace. The headlines had moved on. The scholarship applications began arriving, letters from young women who reminded me of Helen, filled with ideas and determination. Daniel stopped by, often sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit in the garage while I worked. But even in that calm, there were moments when I thought about the letter I'd sent, the one with the check and the photograph. I wondered what she'd do when she opened it, whether she'd curse my name or finally understand what Helen had meant about forgiveness completing justice. Then one morning, as I sipped my coffee by the kitchen window, a news feature came on. It wasn't about me or the scholarship. It was about a local community cafe that had reopened under new management, employing people looking for a second chance. The camera panned across the small brick storefront, its windows fogged from the steam of early customers. And there she was, Claire Bennett, hair pulled back, apron on, handing a cup of coffee to an old man with a shaky hand and a smile that didn't belong to the woman I once knew. She didn't see the camera at first. She just worked quietly, efficiently, her movements stripped of vanity. When the reporter finally asked her a question, she smiled, faintly polite but guarded. "Just trying to rebuild," she said. "One honest day at a time." That was all. The story moved on, but I didn't. I sat there long after the screen went black, remembering the woman who once measured her worth in applause. Maybe Helen had been right again. Some lessons only come after everything else is gone. I imagined the day she received the envelope. The mailroom of that modest apartment complex, the brown walls, and the smell of detergent from the shared laundry room down the hall. I pictured her sorting through bills and advertisements until she saw the return address, Helen and Edward Miller Trust. Maybe her first thought was suspicion, or anger, or even fear. She would have turned it over, hesitated, then finally torn it open. I could see it as clearly as if I'd been standing there, the letter, the check, and the photograph sliding out onto the small kitchen table. Her hand trembling as she picked up the picture, first the glossy print of her standing beside that red Porsche, chin, high, pride, sharp as glass. And then her eyes falling on the words I'd written on the back, "The moment you chose appearances over truth." She would have sat down, the chair creaking under her weight, as she unfolded the letter next. She would have read Helen's name in the header, the calm, deliberate tone of the words we'd written together. I could almost hear her whisper them aloud. "You've lost more than money, more than reputation. You've lost what you once mistook for worth. Maybe that's a gift in disguise." Helen believed everyone deserved one chance to start again, even those who never gave her husband one. And then the check, $50,000. Enough to change a life, but not enough to buy one. Her fingers would have lingered over the ink, tracing the line that read, "For a fresh start." Maybe she cried then. Not the elegant tears she once shed for attention, but the kind that come quietly when you realize the person you wronged still wishes you well. I didn't need to be there to know how that moment felt. I'd lived it once myself years ago when Helen had forgiven me for a mistake I thought she'd never overlook. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice. It completes it. She'd been right, again. In my mind, I saw Claire wipe her eyes, her shoulders trembling as she laughed softly through her tears, a sound she probably hadn't made in months. Maybe she looked around that tiny apartment, the bare shelves, the cracked tiles, and felt for the first time the kind of humility that builds rather than breaks. I imagined her walking to the window, looking out at the street below, the morning sun, filtering through the glass, turning the world gold for just a second. Maybe that was the moment she understood what Helen and I had tried to teach her, not through punishment, but through mercy. She must have stood there for a long while before returning to the table. The photo lay beside the letter, the check resting on top. And there, in the corner of the page, she would have noticed the smaller card I'd slipped in at the last moment, my handwriting unmistakable. Just one final line. "Use it wisely, or prove us wrong again." Later that night, I pictured her at that same table, her face lit by the soft blue glow of a laptop. She'd hesitated at the search bar, her fingers hovering over the keys before typing, slowly, uncertainly. Electrical Engineering Basics online course. The screen filled with results, and she clicked the first one that promised a beginning. Maybe she smiled then. Maybe she whispered Helen's name without realizing it. I didn't know if she'd ever write back or if she'd ever want to. It didn't matter. The act was enough. Forgiveness had left my hands. What she did with it was hers alone. I turned off the television and sat in silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the room. Somewhere out there, a woman who once called me useless trash was learning about circuits and voltage, perhaps realizing for the first time that even broken things can carry current, if you find the right connection. Helen would have liked that. 2 years passed, like the slow turning of pages in a book you're not quite ready to finish. Seasons changed, headlines faded, and life returned to something quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. The Helen Bennett Scholarship had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. What began as a single gesture became a movement, a legacy Helen built with her brilliance, and I carried forward with her memory. Each year, new students filled the auditorium with hope instead of pride, curiosity instead of entitlement. It was the kind of crowd she would have loved. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the high glass windows of the university hall, casting soft gold across the rows of faces. The banners hung with Helen's name in calm blue letters. I sat in the front row, my hands folded over my cane, watching as guests filled the seats. On stage, Amelia, my granddaughter Daniel's oldest, stood behind the podium, poised and confident in a way that felt both familiar and new. She was the same age Helen had been when we first started designing together, and something in her voice carried that same steadiness. "Welcome to the annual Helen Bennett Scholarship Ceremony." She began, her smile warm, genuine. This program was built on a simple belief that brilliance has no boundaries and that kindness can change the course of someone's life. She paused, scanning the audience before continuing. "My grandfather taught me that real strength is quiet. It doesn't need to be seen to be felt." The audience fell into a hush, and I felt something in my chest tighten, pride and grief woven together. She'd taken Helen's lessons and made them her own. Daniel sat beside me, his hand resting lightly on my arm. He didn't need to speak. We both knew what this day meant. Amelia's voice softened. "This year's recipient embodies the very heart of what this scholarship represents. She faced failure and loss, but chose to rebuild through humility and hard work. Please welcome Claire Bennett." The name rippled through the hall like a whisper carried by wind. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a figure rose from the second row and began to walk toward the stage. Claire. Her hair was shorter, now streaked with silver that hadn't been there before. She wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry. There was no trace of the woman who once lived for applause. Every step she took seemed deliberate, as if she'd weighed its meaning. The audience, unsure at first, began to clap softly. By the time she reached the steps, the sound had grown into steady applause. She didn't look toward me right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on Amelia, who extended her hand with a smile that could have been Helen's. Claire took the scholarship certificate with both hands, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "This means more than you know." Amelia smiled. "We know more than you think." There was gentle laughter from the audience, but I could see tears welling in Claire's eyes. She turned, then finally to look at me. For a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. I saw the reflection of that night at the gala, the sharpness of her words, the humiliation, the gold Porsche outside, gleaming in the dark. But that woman was gone. What stood before me now was someone who had learned the hardest way what Helen had always tried to teach, that worth has nothing to do with wealth, and forgiveness is the only real inheritance we ever pass down. Her gaze met mine, steady and searching. I didn't smile, and I didn't need to. I simply nodded once. It was enough. She bowed her head slightly, her shoulders shaking as tears slipped down her cheeks. Amelia continued speaking, her words fading into the background as the sound of applause swelled again. I barely heard her, something about legacy, innovation, future partnerships, but all I could think of was how Helen would have loved this ending. Not revenge, not victory, but renewal. When the ceremony ended, people began to stand and mingle. Amelia came down from the stage to hug me. "You okay, Grandpa?" she asked. I nodded. "Better than okay." Daniel shook my hand, his eyes glistening. "She really did it," he said softly. "Yes," I said. "She did." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Claire approach. She stopped a few feet away, clutching the folder to her chest. "Mr. Miller," she said. It was the first time she'd called me that in years. "I don't know if I deserve this, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." I studied her face, the humility, the effort, the quiet grace that comes only from understanding loss. "You don't have to prove anything," I said gently. "Just live better than you did before." She nodded, tears slipping free, then turned and walked toward the exit, sunlight catching her hair as she went. I watched her go until she disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the brightness beyond the doors. Amelia returned to the podium to close the ceremony. "Every generation leaves behind something," she said. "Some leave wealth, others leave wisdom, but the rarest few leave peace." The audience rose to their feet, clapping again. I looked toward the stage where Helen's portrait hung, framed in gold light, her eyes calm and knowing. Claire had stopped by the doorway, looking back just once. Our eyes met one final time. She bowed her head slightly, and I answered with a single nod. No words, no apologies, just understanding. The applause rose around us, filling the hall like a tide. In that sound, I heard the end of everything we had been and the beginning of everything we could be. And as the crowd stood, the cameras flashing and Amelia's voice echoing through the hall, I felt Helen beside me once more. Forgiveness at last was complete. The morning after the scholarship ceremony, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft blue that comes before sunrise. For a long time, I just sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the world, waking up the slow hum of the refrigerator, a bird calling somewhere outside, the gentle creak of the house settling around me. I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the peace of silence or solitude, but of completion. The calm that comes when you've said everything that needed saying, and learned to stop reaching for what's already been mended. On the dresser sat a photograph from the night before. Amelia bright-eyed and confident behind the podium. Daniel standing tall beside her. And Claire, her face turned toward the light, caught mid-applause. I'd asked one of the photographers to send me a copy. Now it leaned against the mirror, a snapshot of something Helen had always believed in, renewal. I picked it up, tracing my thumb along its edge, then set it down again. The garage key lay beside it, warm from the morning light spilling through the window. Outside, the sky was starting to change. The first threads of gold stretched across the horizon, weaving through the soft gray clouds. It felt like Helen's way of calling me, the same way she used to when she'd whisper from the workshop, "Come see what the sun's doing to the ocean." I smiled at the memory, pulled on my jacket, and stepped outside. The Porsche waited in the driveway, dew glistening along its golden surface. 2 years had passed since I'd finished it, but every time I touched the handle, it still felt new, alive. I slid into the driver's seat and let my hand rest on the steering wheel. The leather had softened with age, molded perfectly to my grip. The engine started with a quiet purr, not loud or boastful, just steady, the kind of sound that doesn't need attention to be felt. The road to the coast was empty. As I drove, the world unfolded in slow motion, the soft light spilling across the trees, the mist rising from the fields, the distant hum of waves beyond the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and pine. I rolled down the window and let the wind move through the car, carrying with it fragments of memory, Helen's laughter, Daniel's boyish excitement, the rustle of old blueprints across our kitchen table. I'd driven this route before years ago, when Helen and I were younger, before ambition and pride had tangled our lives with others. Back then, we'd pull over at the Overlook Park beneath the same bent cypress tree and sit on the hood with coffee and conversation. She'd sketch designs on napkins and I'd pretend to understand every line. "We'll build something that lasts," she used to say. "Something that outlives both of us." As the coastline came into view, I slowed the car. The sun was rising now, spilling fire across the water, turning everything it touched into gold. I followed the curve of the road until I reached that same overlook. I parked, turned off the engine, and let the silence fill the space between the waves and me. The glove compartment caught my eye. It had been months since I'd opened it. I leaned forward and clicked the latch. Inside were the familiar contents, a few maps, a pair of Helen's old sunglasses, and beneath them an envelope I didn't recognize. It was smaller than the others, folded neatly with my name written in her handwriting. I felt the air leave my lungs. Somehow, even after all this time, she'd found one last way to speak. I opened it carefully, afraid the years might have made the paper too fragile. Inside was a single note written in her confident, looping script. "If they ever call you trash, show them what gold looks like." I laughed softly, the sound catching in my throat. That was Helen, direct, unyielding, and kind all at once. The words pulled me back to that night in the Bennett mansion, to Claire's laughter, to the moment I'd stood holding a tray of champagne, feeling every pair of eyes waiting for me to break. I hadn't realized until now how much of that moment had been hers. Her strength, her grace, her unspoken reminder that dignity doesn't shout, it shines. I folded the note and slipped it into my jacket pocket. For a long time, I just sat there watching the ocean breathe. The tide moved in and out, endless, unhurried. The horizon stretched wide and open, and for the first time I understood what Helen had meant about legacy. It wasn't in the money, the scholarship, or even the car. It was in the choice to keep building when others tear down, to keep forgiving when it's easier to forget. I thought of Daniel rebuilding his life with humility, of Amelia carrying forward Helen's brilliance, of Claire learning about circuits and current, discovering how even broken things can carry power again. And I thought of Helen, her laughter still somewhere in the wind, her words etched into everything I'd ever touched since she left. I started the engine again, not to leave, but to move, because motion, she used to say, is proof of life. The Porsche came to life beneath my hands, the hum deep and steady. I guided it down the winding road that hugged the cliffs, the sunlight chasing me in the mirrors. The ocean stretched endlessly beside me, waves catching the light and throwing it back in flashes of white and gold. The radio played softly some forgotten song from decades ago, one Helen used to hum while she worked. I didn't sing along. I didn't need to. The rhythm of the road was enough. Each curve brought a new shimmer of light, a reminder that the world, for all its cruelty, still knew how to be beautiful. Somewhere between one turn and the next, I found myself speaking aloud, though there was no one to hear. "You were right, Helen," I said, my voice almost carried away by the wind. "Some people are born with gold. Others earn it by becoming it." The words settled in the air like a prayer. Ahead, the sun climbed higher, flooding the sea with color. The light spilled across the hood of the Porsche, and for a moment it felt as if Helen were sitting beside me again, her hand on the dashboard, her eyes on the horizon, smiling that quiet, knowing smile. I drove until the road curved downward toward the beach, where the waves met the sand in a steady rhythm. I pulled over and stepped out, letting the wind whip through my hair. The ocean roared below, vast and endless, and the morning light burned brighter than ever, turning the golden car into a mirror for the sky itself. I closed my eyes and listened to the waves, to the hum of the engine, cooling to the faint echo of her laughter somewhere in the distance. The sea smelled like salt and new beginnings. I breathed it in slow and deep and felt something inside me unclench. When I opened my eyes, the sun had fully risen, its reflection dancing across the Porsche's curves like liquid fire. The tide surged forward, breaking into white spray that glittered against the rocks. And for a moment, everything, the car, the sea, the light, merged into one unbroken shimmer of gold. The waves crashed steady and eternal, and the golden car reflected the sunlight back into the world, a final testament to dignity reborn. Every story ends, but some leave echoes that never fade. Edward's journey was not about revenge. It was about rediscovering dignity, the quiet strength that outlasts cruelty. From humiliation to forgiveness, his path proved that real gold isn't measured by wealth or recognition, but by the courage to stay kind when others turn cold. Helen's wisdom became more than a message in a letter. It became a legacy that changed lives, bridging generations through compassion and purpose. Claire's transformation showed that redemption is possible even for those who once lost their way, and the golden Porsche became a symbol not of power but of grace, earned through struggle. Justice, mercy, and forgiveness, three words that together define the true measure of a life well lived. If you felt something while reading Edward and Helen's story, if it reminded you of someone you once forgave or someone you wish would forgive you, share your thoughts below. Tell us which moment touched you most. Was it the mirror dinner, the auction, or the final drive along the coast? Your reflections help this community grow stronger through stories that remind us we can still rise with grace no matter how broken we feel. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what lesson you took away from Edward's journey, because sometimes one story of redemption can awaken another waiting inside you.